Welcome back, everybody, to Interact. This is amazing. And Kyla Scanlon is here with us today, who is one of our most beloved friends. And not only the great Gen Z economist, everybody's favorite TikToker, the writer of In This Economy, also a very active and passionate Interact guest and host. I think, Kyla, you were first on Interact in 2022 in the summer. I remember that. And since then, you have been at multiple Interact salons, visited multiple longer series. You also have participated in a variety of different festivals offline that we've done. And you even hosted your own offline series in this economy as you were writing your book. So this is truly an incredible friendship for us. And we are so privileged and blessed to have you among us. I think you embody so many of the intellect qualities, being fearless and public and egalitarian, but also very interdisciplinary in a very kind of no-nonsense way, being as deeply in the social sciences of it all as, internet anthropology and the arts and creativity and how people live. I'm so happy that you're back with us. How are you doing? And welcome back.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about the topic today. And yeah, it's been fun being a part of Intellect over the years. I'm in Washington, DC right now, and yeah, everything's good.
What's the
Everything's
vibe
good.
in DC? I think everybody in the world right now has some kind of theory about what's going on in DC. How has it been to arrive there now? I think you went yesterday, right?
No, I took the red eye in, so
Okay.
my energy levels are
We'll try
concerning,
to
but
keep moving.
and I'm taking the 10 p.m. out tonight, but that whatever, that's my problem. But yeah, I mean, I was on the Hill this morning. I'm doing a lot of trying to understand sort of the relationship between AI and labor. So what does it look like to integrate AI into the labor force? What sorts of policies should we be integrating to help people not be displaced by this technology and to support workers during this transition? So that's been the main focus today. Yeah. And for the past couple of months.
So you won't be joined by any of your dogs today to entertain us.
No, I'm in a hotel.
Oh, because that's one of the upsides beyond the amazing conversation and ideas that one can have hosting Kyla Scanlon is like every once in a while, like the most adorable dogs in the world will join the conversation and have their
Yeah.
own opinions. So we can go a little bit beyond just the human elements here. I really would like to go back in time a little bit because, as your audience and your friends have had the privilege of following your career, and kind of like this meteoric rise and like you're one of the online creators who have truly created their own jobs. I think if people think about TikTok economists, they will think of you. I mean, if there is an Encyclopedia Britannica entry for this thing, it's going to have your photo, like you created this work through your work, which I think is kind of like everybody's ambition in the 21st century. We want to like so deeply personalize and customize our output that many of us feel like, like I built Interact and this is kind of like its own category, and this is something that now can come out of just like you doing your job and focusing on what you're good at. But I remember when you started out and eventually you started writing about the vibe session and you famously coined this term. And today everybody in policymaking uses this term as if it had already existed since forever, even though no, it's just been a couple of years. But we've also, observed you becoming more and more political. For instance, you're calling in from DC, like that's relatively new in your life. You spent your morning on the Hill. That is, again, something relatively new. So what was your political journey and what made you get involved in this crazy thing that American politics is? Were you so bored? Did you not have enough problems? Like what
Or
was, what happened?
yeah, I mean, I think my relationship with politics and perhaps other people in the room agree is that I want to see the best things done. I don't really care who does it. I'm not really assigned on either side. I just want to see policies put forward that I think help people. So I focus a lot on housing policy, and I have since the beginning of my career. I focus a lot on economic equality. So what does it look like for asset ownership to be more accessible to everybody, both in terms of the stock market, financial literacy, as well as, again, owning a home. And then, yeah, I mean, I don't even know if doing like AI labor policy is political as much as it's just trying to make sense of this thing that's like rapidly barreling toward us. And so, I do economics education, and a big part of economics education is giving people agency. And one of the main ways that you give people agency is through the levers of policy. So I've never thought of it as becoming more political. That's not great if that's what it seems like. I don't want to give off that sense, but it's really, I think, just noticing what needs to happen, hearing from the audience what needs to happen. Somebody didn't like that it's not political, I guess, and they left. But yeah, anyway, so that's kind of
Politically,
how I
not
think
a
about it.
partisan sense. It's political as like, I'm a citizen and I have ideas about this thing and I want things to go better via maybe in some cases political means or policy means.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think both of us we've talked a lot about just sort of the worries around some of the stuff that's happening that I think just objectively data-wise is bad. If you remove emotion and ideology from the equation, we have data on like what tariffs do to small businesses. We have data on the importance of supporting people during a technological transition, like what happened with manufacturing. I'm from Kentucky. It got wiped out by the shift of manufacturing overseas. We just don't want that to happen again to people. So a lot of my work is like really just trying to center people in politics, learn from what we know about the data, and then help people kind of through all of that.
How do you see and by the way, I'm going to ask Kyla a couple of questions and then we will open the floor. If you feel like you need to jump in right now because you have some question that really relates to what we're talking about right now, you're also welcome to raise your hand via Zoom and we will try to come to you throughout the conversation. I'm really curious, Kyla, how do you see, I mean, for the casual observer, being an internet creator gives you almost a populist type of power where you can bypass the other experts, the institutional guardrails, even established media, and directly address the population.
Mhm.
Right? It's a very liberating thing. And I think a lot of the great thinkers of today would not have necessarily readily have made it in the traditional process, and they could just like bypass it, talk directly to their audience, and became very big in that way. How do you see the difference in how you can call for change or raise awareness of an issue that's important to you? Let's use, replacement by AI in the workforce is a good example. How do the mechanics and the kind of effects differ between like going to DC and like talking to actual decision makers, policymakers versus going and like addressing the general population?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think kind of what you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the role of listening to the general public and then the role of policymakers in deciding what direction to go. Is that right?
I think listening, yes, but also like, do you need to use, for instance, different rhetorical skills? Do you have to talk about a different area within the problem? And when we talk about, humans fearing a replacement by AI, I would imagine it's like a vast literature. Do you have to like put a different part of it in the front for the general audience
Mm.
versus policymakers? And how did you learn that? How are you experimenting with that?
Yeah, it's an experimentation. I don't know if I've totally learned it. I mean, I think the biggest thing that I've noticed and have learned from others who do this sort of work is these problems are very emotional. And so when you talk to the general, like I've been on the road for the past year and a half with my book, I was gone 40 weeks out of the past 52 weeks last year, talking to the public, trying to get a sense of what they need and want out of the economy. So I spent a long time, trying to understand where people are coming from and where they want to go. And so that's been the big focus. And only recently have I sort of accidentally almost forayed into the more policy side of stuff. And that's more so just because that's where a lot of stuff has to happen. Like there's a big balance between policy solutions and then market-driven solutions, and then you can have a mix of the two. And so what I've just heard in the conversations from people around how they're feeling about AI, especially college students, is that they're really wanting somebody to do anything about it and have some sort of support function. And I think the tough part right now is that the labs, and this is just what it seems like it's happening. And from my conversations with people, the labs are just moving real quick, and they're businesses, and so they'll just move quick, and it seems sort of move fast and break things in a lot of ways. And you have to have policy kind of come in and help people when that's the situation. And it's not anybody's fault. It's just the incentives at play. Mm.
I don't know when was the last time when an economist spoke so eloquently and deeply and respectfully about people's feelings. I mean, there's a reason why well, Vibe Session, Encyclopedia Britannica entry will feature your photo. You also talk about markets as truth signal, which I find a very interesting adoption on your side. Tell us a little bit about feelings. Obviously, the past week, I mean, obviously, this video will be watched for a long time by people. But today, in January 2026, we're coming together from around America and the world for this conversation on Interinteract. I assume from different like politics and different maybe economic ideologies, and that's completely fine. But I mean, it would be hard to argue that the past 2 weeks, that was basically 2026 so far, hadn't been very emotional for a lot of people. Emotions are running super high, both internally in America and in terms of the geopolitical development. Do you see that your role is to step back a little bit from the feelings and be like, okay, what is underneath it all? What are the facts? What is the data? Or do you actually see this volatility that we're living macro, micro level as the data itself? How do you make sense of it? And how do you keep your own serenity? Because I see you as a very serene person.
Well, that's good. That's yeah, not
You're the only one, but I'm always right about this stuff, so you can trust.
That's funny. Yeah, I ride my bike a lot, and that helps. But I mean, I interviewed two Fed presidents last week, and the transcript is up on my Substack. And these are, huge decision makers. These are the people who are deciding the course of monetary policy. So what the Fed does with interest rates, and obviously there was the news about Fed Chair Jerome Powell just a few days after our interview came out, where Fed Chair Jerome Powell asserted that Trump was threatening Powell with a criminal indictment because Powell wouldn't cut interest rates. And we don't have to get into the mechanics of monetary policy, but so that happened. And then I had this interview with the Fed president, and Mary Daly, who's the president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, said something that I think is really important when we think about an era of volatility, is that for the past 40 years, we've been in this thing called the Great Moderation. And so that's a period of macroeconomic stability where we had independent central banks. We had technology growing, so we were able to forecast business cycles better. So it wasn't as big of a boom and bust. And obviously, we still had things like the Latin debt crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble in the States, the great financial crisis. So there were still these huge downturns, but it was a period of relative stability throughout economies because of independent central banks, because of technology, and then also because of trade. All of a sudden, we had all of these things that we were able to get from other countries, and free trade does ultimately create wealth in a lot of ways, and it helps stabilize the economy too, because it's not so reliant on manufacturing in the case of the States to be successful. And so when we think about a period of volatility, President Mary Daly said that we're essentially exiting this great moderation, and President Barkin of the Richmond Federal Reserve said the same thing, that the biggest point of uncertainty right now for the Fed, the central bank of the United States, a huge policy body, is the persistence of uncertainty. That's like the number one thing that they're worried about, is like, how do you navigate an economy that's changing so quickly, especially when it comes to technology, especially when it comes to some of the bumps that we're seeing with fiscal policy. So what the president is doing, even if you agree with the policies, it does produce some volatility. And so that's I think where this is where two experts are. And I think it's a pretty good theory to subscribe to, is that we are exiting this period of stability primarily because of the actions of the administration. They just have different priorities, the Don Roe doctrine, and that is going to insert a lot of change into the United States. It's going to insert a lot of change into how the economy operates. And then when you think about how concentrated the economy is, the only jobs that we've been adding are in healthcare and social services, and then most of our economic growth is coming from AI. And so the economy itself is quite posed for tremendous volatility, just because there's not a lot of buffer. There's not a lot of space for any mistakes to happen, especially if the AI industry does slow down in terms of the stock market too. So yeah, I think that's what everybody's really worried about. Like it's like can't really escape any room without somebody bringing up the AI bubble. And you can't really escape any room either without somebody bringing up what's happening with the government. So I think that is just very different than what we're used to. It's always been tough. It's always been different. Things have always been shifting, but now it's shifting so quickly because of what we're seeing again with technology and again with some of the decisions from the fiscal policy side.
Do you see responses where there is this enormous uncertainty and it always continues, right? Because people are used to uncertain periods and then they just don't stop, right? It's a little bit like how the human body responds to stress. Like we are kind of built for short-term stress, but if it becomes a chronic thing, kind of everything becomes subjugated to it, and all your natural like instincts and defenses are suddenly meaningless. And I mean, we talk about like stress tests in the economy for a reason. It's almost like when you're like stress testing, the beams of a house, they should be able to tolerate a certain amount of, unplanned event, but there is like a breaking point. And what I'm seeing is people responding to the uncertainty as a kind of their best idea of how to avoid breaking points. But if I understand you correctly, what you mean is like some of these responses actually create a worse situation than otherwise would have been. Is this correct? And if so, what should they be doing instead?
What should the individual be doing to respond
What
to it?
should no, how could we do the economy better?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's like the whole field. I was trying to
The
figure that
many
out.
trillion dollar question.
Yeah, no, super trillion-dollar question. I mean, I think it's so Greg Ip in the Wall Street Journal, if people subscribe to it, he's great on this topic. He writes a lot about policy. So this is it's a kind of a policy heavy conversation, probably because where I'm at, and it's top of mind. But he wrote this interesting piece talking about the three levers of the economy. So if you want to speed an economy up or slow it down, you essentially have three ways to do it. You can do it through fiscal policy, so what the government is doing with taxation or government spending, so what the government chooses to spend money on, or how it chooses to tax its constituents. And then you have monetary policy, so what the Federal Reserve does, where they raise and lower interest rates, they use their balance sheet as a tool. And then you also have credit. So essentially how easy it is to borrow money. A lot of that is through regulation, but it's also through the banks. And so what Greg pointed out in this piece is that fiscal policy is like full steam ahead. We have these huge tax cuts coming. We have, tariff paychecks being talked about. We have, I guess, the acquisition of Greenland. All of these things are happening that are creating a lot of pressure on the economy, but also creating a lot of potential growth, especially if you think about how tax cuts will move through the economy and give people a lot of spending power, hypothetically. And then you have monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve has been somewhat on a rate cutting journey. So they're essentially making money easier. They're like, hey, if you want a loan, we're going to make it pretty simple for you. And it's meant to encourage people to go out and spend money, open up the economy, get things moving. They would hike rates, which is what they were doing during the pandemic if they wanted to slow the economy down. And so the Federal Reserve for a long time was cutting rates, but more so recently, they've talked about pausing, not moving interest rates around as much because they're worried. Their dual mandate is price stability and maximum employment. So they want to make sure that things aren't too expensive and that anybody who wants a job can have a job. And so that's another lever of the economy that you can pull if you want things to move faster, slower. And then you have credit. And so credit's really interesting because the banks are doing so well. Like BlackRock has a ton of assets under management. There is all the banks are having earnings right now, and there's record dividends, there's record buybacks, they're firing a bunch of people to kind of improve the balance sheet. And there's also changes in terms of how the Trump administration is approaching banking, where they're loosening up credit. They're enabling it to be a little bit easier for the banks to do loans. And so that's, again, going to speed up the economy too. And so if you think about wanting to kind of change uncertainty in the economy, or just at least close the faucet a bit so it's not running as hot, you would move one of those three levers. But what the Trump administration objectively wants is, Trump has been very clear that he wants, interest rates to be cut. He's been very clear about having fiscal policy be very stimulative, all sorts of announcements, credit card interest rates capped at 10%, stopping institutional buyers from buying up homes, $200 billion in mortgage bond buybacks, are meant to sort of appease the consumer and then hopefully have the consumer spend more, wants rate cuts so people spend more, and then is loosening up credit conditions so ultimately people and businesses spend more. And so those are kind of the things that, if we think about how to make the economy a bit better, those are three primary tools that we can really use if we think about it from a policy angle. Because if you don't want a repeat of 2008, for example, the banks just get into all sorts of nonsense because they're banks and that's their incentive, and that's what they do. I think we really have to keep that top of mind, is that people are ultimately always responding to incentives. And so banks, they can create quite a mess of stuff. And then, monetary policy, if the Fed starts cutting rates too quickly, then we'll have a real problem with inflation. And that certainly doesn't make people happy. And then from a fiscal policy angle, tax cuts are great, but eventually somebody has to pay taxes. And so the worry, especially if we buy it, the US is talking about spending billions of dollars buying another country. So there has the rooster always comes home, or whatever the metaphor is. What is that metaphor? The hen always comes home to net. You do know what I'm talking about?
The chickens come home to roost.
Oh yeah, sorry. Long day.
Yeah.
But
they have to roost somewhere.
The rooster always comes home. So that's the thing. It's
like a metaphor-defying situation. I think that's everything. The English language doesn't have enough metaphors to fully capture. Yeah,
that's true. We are kind of at the limits of language here.
We need new ones.
So that's if we think about making the economy better, those are the three things.
But some things are happening. So you're not this is shit, everything. Some things are happening. It's just a very complex situation, and the methodology is almost religious within economics, right? There are people who say that this works, people who say that clearly the truth is some very contingent mix in the middle, infused with real life and external events and unpredictable stuff. The question is whether you put the right people in the room and let them kind of fight it out.
Yeah, I mean, some people don't want any government intervention, right? They want the market to solve all of it. They want people to solve all of their own problems. Some people are very reliant on the government, and they want universal basic income, and they want total support for people. So it is kind of always a balance. I mean, I think where I sit is that we have to have a mix of both, both market-driven solutions and government-driven solutions are important, because there's some things that markets are just, not so good at achieving, some things that the government's not so good at achieving. So I think I'm hopeful about, I'm hopeful. You kind of have to be, so you don't get too upset. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of good people in the world, and there's a lot of really interesting people working on a lot of really important problems. So I'm hopeful that we'll figure it out. It just might be kind of weird for a bit.
I'm with you. I think measured hope, hope axis, there's a gradient. I would love to move on a little bit into the question of how not to kill democracy, which is our title for today, before I open the floor, because if I'm understanding through your essays, which are truly formidable, and I just enjoy them tremendously, including your matchstick drawings. Like I think like the magic comes from this incongruence of very serious economics and social analysis and matchstick figures. I think this is underrated as a combination. You argue that uncertainty, as in the kind of micro level in a human life, does some really weird stuff to how people experience the world, how they make decisions, how they see their trade-offs. And that there is something in long-term uncertainty that just truly messes with the kind of cognitive foundations of both individuals and like the collective cooperative level of society. So how do you think about uncertainty, and has this evolved for you since, say, in this economy? So in the past 2 years, are you updating your concepts of uncertainty as uncertainty basically stays with us?
I mean that's what a lot of people are saying is that yeah, I don't know if I've ever heard that word more than I have over the past couple of months. It feels like that's sort of the if you look at, Bloomberg does a great roundup of the 2026 outlooks of all the big banks, and that was like a big theme is we don't really know where to put our money. We're gonna invest abroad. We're gonna maybe get some exposure to gold, which is always an uncertainty hedge, and then have some exposure to the tech stocks just because they don't ever seem to go down. But I think
I have
like,
a source, so I just want to inject this thing here. Like, I have an investor, like, we are fundraising now, and I have an investor who suspended his fund now because it's like so volatile that he's like not touching it, which is, of course,
with
an
startups,
extreme thing, but he's waiting it out, which I've been in the industry for like a while, and this is the first time I'm encountering something like that.
people are scared, yeah. And yeah, rightly so. It doesn't, a lot of big asset managers are going to cash too. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think like uncertainty is just sort of a given of the human experience. I don't think anybody needs me to tell them that. It seems like it's just a part of all of our lives in a very meaningful way. But when we think about the economy, like a big goal of the economy is to try to eliminate forms of uncertainty. So I think it really began in 1913 with the establishment of the Federal Reserve, where we kind of realized that the only way that we were going to grow the economy was through some form of stabilization of money. So the Fed was established because before the Fed was established, we had wildcat banks. There was all sorts of crazy lending. All the banks were going bankrupt. And then
Like
JP
in the
Morgan.
Western movies when they go in with a bag of money and then
Yeah,
somebody
yeah,
comes in with a gun and then a horse and then end of movie.
exactly. Yeah.
Stability.
Yeah, no, that's super correct. But yeah, so JP Morgan of JP Morgan Chase, it was the guy who went in and bailed everybody out. And he was essentially like, I can't keep on doing this. We have to establish some sort of central body to help control money and to help control and make sense of this and to help people so the economy can grow, so we can have stuff be a little bit more stable. And so I think the attempted stabilization of the economy really began then. And then we had the rollout of things like the New Deal that were meant to support workers, meant to provide them some protections, again, to stabilize the economy. Happy worker helps the economy grow a bit faster. And ever since then, we've had policies sort of roll out that have been in that service. I think the one time, I'm not a Reagan hater, but like the one time that we sort of saw the rollback of that is with the idea of trickle down economics, and that like, oh, if we just sort of serve this part of the economy, then everybody will be happy, and that just wasn't the case. And so that wasn't a good path to reduce uncertainty, and I think it has created some systemic problems in terms of how we think about policy ever since then. But yeah, uncertainty is pretty much a given, and yeah, the goal of an economy is to have an element of uncertainty, because yes, you need uncertainty to grow. But it's, yeah, to help minimize it where it makes sense, and ideally have pretty clear guidelines in terms of trade for companies, have pretty clear guidelines on what their taxation is going to be, clear guidelines on where and when they can do business, and same for consumers. You want people who are going and getting a college degree to know that they're going to have some job opportunities after that. Yeah.
there's uncertainty and then there's fear, right? And these two
Mm.
things are very, very different. And, I'm sure behavioral scientists would be able to show like some kind of experiment with rats and how long they are waiting for their variable reward, little pellets coming out of the feeder. Uncertainty is also optionality in many ways, right? Like uncertainty is needed for me to feel like I have, like it's the opposite of stasis. Like I can move, I can evolve, I can change, I can learn. Chaos is a ladder. Fear is a much less hopeful feeling, obviously. It means that it's uncertainty, but I'm much more sure that the outcome will be bad. You do talk about this when it comes to Gen Z and when it comes to social inequality, when it comes to owning assets as a kind of grounding for participating in democracy. I mean, a lot of traditional democracies were based on ownership. Like who the people like the first voters were people who owned property and the property owners could come and vote. I mean, one of the reasons why it took such a long time in the world to give suffrage to women is because women were not the owners. So, like, the owner of the house went to vote, which was the pater familias, which was the father. And so I'm quite interested in how you model this. You say that some uncertainty is obviously needed for the economy to stay dynamic, but that there is some darker emotion here lurking in the Gen Z culture where people say are much less certain that they will ever be able to repay their student loans, that they will ever be able to have savings or hold down a job, let alone buy property or buy property in a metro area where the actual jobs and networks and kind of social dynamism are. So how do you think about this these days? And is 2026 for you a special time in this sense where, I mean, Gen Z are now adults. We used to talk about Gen Z as the kids. I mean, you guys are now, I mean, not middle-aged yet. That's us millennials, but yeah, we're getting there, getting there.
No, yeah, I'm the oldest one, and I just turned 28, so that's old. Yeah, it's old. And
Old. It's technically a Paleolithic grandmother. I know, I know.
I feel that way. Yeah, I feel ancient. But I've heard that you feel old in your late 20s and you feel young in your early 30s. I've heard that's like how it
30
works.
is a very, like, turning 30 is a very big moment. I just turned
Yeah.
40, and that's also, there's also
Happy
something
birthday.
there that is, that's a different change. I think
Mm.
turning 30 for a woman is like, that's when you become a woman.
Oh,
And turning
well.
40 is that's when you become a very angry woman.
Oh,
That's a different sliding
a
scale.
lot to look forward to. Good.
30 is
Okay.
like people are now listening to me, and 40 is that people are now listening to me, and I'm going to tell them that they're stupid. It's too, and I'm joking. I mean, I'm parodying this, but there is like your empathy for humanity goes up and your tolerating of individual bullshit goes down. I
Mm,
think there is just like
mm.
inverse
Yeah.
proportionality there.
Yeah. Macro versus micro, for sure. Yeah.
So how are our Gen Z doing? What's going to happen to them, and how can we make them a little bit less unsafe in this society?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the concept that you're getting at is the idea of financial nihilism. It's become kind of a meme on Twitter, unfortunately, where a lot of articles have gone viral, sort of proclaiming it. But the term itself was coined by Dimitri Kofinas, who runs the Hidden Forces podcast, back in 2021. He's great, a lot of really interesting viewpoints and very changing viewpoints too. He always incorporates a lot of new information. But so he coined that term to kind of define this time where everybody, not just young people, are looking around at the economy and saying, all right, I don't really know if I'm ever going to be able to buy a house. I don't really know if like my job is going to work out. It feels like my career is not very stable. I'm not sure if I can achieve this American dream that we know of like buying a house, having kids, building out a stable family, retiring one day. And so what people end up doing is they just spend all their money. They don't really worry about retirement. They don't really worry about tomorrow. It's just like, okay, I want to go to Europe today. So that's what I'm going to do. And the thing with Gen Z is they have money. And there's an element of aspirational displacement, which is where I think we see the rise of gambling, the rise of things like Labubu, if everyone knows what that is. They're not in style as much as they used to be.
Sadly, we do. We do know what you're talking about. We
About
wish we
Labubu.
didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you see people have excess income, but they don't have the path to buying a house. So they spend it on something else, or they go and gamble because again, there's sort of a risk reward issue where it's like, I'm just going to take on all this risk because I feel like this stable path doesn't make as much sense as it maybe used to. And so that's the element of financial nihilism that is something that's a bit tough to navigate because when we think about maintaining trust in a democracy, it becomes rather difficult. And so the main reason that Gen Z voted for Donald Trump was because, in great numbers, is because they wanted him to fix the economy. Ever since, he was elected about a year ago, a lot of people have turned against him in the younger cohort because it hasn't quite worked out. But that's kind of the problem is that it feels like this path toward American prosperity, whatever it used to be, doesn't quite exist. And when you think about sort of how assets and wealth is spread in the United States, I wrote a Wall Street Journal article about this, where boomers, for reasons that make sense, own 75% of the wealth in the country. And so there's a lot of there's a great wealth transfer that's going to be happening. So it's about $84 trillion going from the boomers to the rest of the general population, including Gen Z. But for a lot of young people, because millennials, Gen X, everyone, it can feel quite difficult because there is so much concentration of wealth in an older population.
And nobody wants to wait for their like parents or grandparents to die. Like I'm pretty sure that in America, in the American dreams context, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Like people's dream in this country is not that, like in some Agatha Christie novel, you have to wait for like your old auntie who doesn't have kids to die and leave you a house. You want to like participate in the economy and start a business or get really good at your job and get promoted. You want, I think, especially in America, in this very like Protestant work ethic
Mhm.
environment, your work and your career attainment are the basis for your self-respect. Like you want to
Mhm.
earn it in a very specific way. It's a very competitive country. So I can imagine that that's not making people happier to know that, oh, maybe in like 30 years while going through major bereavement, you will also get money that you cannot even be proud of.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky. And when we think about the data behind, Gen Z home ownership, 1 in 4 Gen Zs do own a home, but I think it's like 80% of them had to have help from their parents in terms of buying it. So it's really a tough one. And there's a great Wall Street Journal article. I keep on referencing them today, but there's a great Wall Street Journal article talking about how even the parents of young people are worried. They have pretty good survey data where they're asking parents of people who are in their 20s, and the parents are like, I feel like I have better opportunities than my kids did. I feel like I had a better path toward building wealth. I feel like I'm more stable than they're ever going to be. And so there's sort of nihilism on both sides where, the boomers seem a bit nervous for their kids are nervous too. And I think this is I think part of it is social media, um, where everybody's comparing and there's sort of this like, race to the top. And then I think, yeah, part of it too is that there's a real reality where, it's a question mark about what the job is, the career path outside of like working at an AI lab that will help you have a stable life. Consultants, that was like one path that a lot of people would take, and now that's essentially being outsourced to AI in a very meaningful way. Sort of the same with the investment industry. There's, a lot of worries, I think, about what people should do with their lives and how to make it a bit more stable.
And if we think about the American dream as a kind of multi-generational project traditionally, how does it look when different, like when a multitude of generations are alive at the same time? Because we have like increased life expectancy, especially in some classes within America, and different like generational strata have completely different incentives and possibilities. So say you have, I don't know, a Gen X generation who are buying property, maybe two properties, cars, they are moving up into upper middle class through hard work. And then you have a Gen Z generation who are also like marriageable age and who don't necessarily have those expectations, who have the
Yeah.
American dream minus these traditional assets. Can these
Yeah.
generations coexist and cooperate? I mean, they live in completely different countries.
Yeah. I haven't read the book that DJ recommends, Boomsday, but that might give us some answers there around if people can coexist. I
DJ,
mean,
do you want to say a few words about that?
I mean, it's been a long time since I read
Yeah.
it.
yeah.
But I mean, it's from the blog era. It's, maybe 2006. And
Mhm.
it just occurred to me that maybe Kyla could lead this. It's basically about a blogger who's like a staffer in DC, and she kind of gets blackpilled about
Mm,
the cost of Social Security and Medicare.
mm.
Um, and like writes this blog post that's just like, we need to kill all the boomers. And it leads, to this basically a big mass uprising and protests and things like that. And it occurred to me that maybe there's some TikToker who could do that these days.
Oh goodness. Um, yeah, no, there's definitely generational resentment. It's I hosted a panel today on the Hill, and there's a great economist who's up in Michigan, and a lot of his work is on demographics. And essentially, I don't know if we need to kill people. I don't condone that. But by 2040, 1 in 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. And so the economy, like the shape of the economy itself, is like really going to shift as the boomers age because they, number one, will require a lot of healthcare support, which is why we see the growth of healthcare jobs and social services. And then number two, yeah, there's going to be this big question mark around Social Security and sort of assistance for the boomers. 43% of them have no retirement savings. So that's also going to be a big question mark, is like, how do we take care of an aging population that doesn't have the resources that they need? And that also, I think, points to the wealth inequality within every strata, within every demographic, where you have a lot of boomers that do have 2, 3 homes, and then you have some that don't. And it creates a very difficult economy to navigate. And during the pandemic, we had a closing of the gap of income inequality for the first time in a very long time, where lower income workers were finally able to catch up to higher income workers. That gap has since widened even more. The wealth inequality gap is even worse. And yeah, that's a whole other can of worms that will probably come up with the demographic conversation, is what does it look like when some parts of the population inherit a bunch of money and some don't, right? And there's the way that we tax inheritance is a bit, there's a lot of loopholes that people can jump through. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of questions. I'll have to read Boomsday and see what their solution is outside killing people. I don't condone that.
I mean,
Voluntary exit.
people to start asking their questions, but I just one last from me here. Do you see that level of like whether that's financial nihilism or just financial reshuffling that Gen Z are going through, and we could assume probably that Gen Alpha will also experience a version of that. Do you think that that unlocks a new type of American dream that maybe is a positive change? I mean, if you go back to like beginning, like the American dream didn't always consist of living in a Mac mansion with two incredibly useless, ugly cars, and like getting an indoor fountain. They were more about like the pioneering spirit and like experimental communities. And like there were a lot of like more, and there was a plasticity to the American dream traditionally, up to actually like the mid 20th century. And even
Yeah.
then, right, like there was the suburban American dream, but like right on top of it started the whole hippie movement that
Right.
thought the whole thing. So it was never a clean deal. So is there something that the older generations are learning from Gen Z, you think, about what it means to be American, what it means to have to like first principles rethink, what success even is, what it
Yeah.
means to attain, and be proud of yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. That's kind of what I'm working on a second book, and that's what that's about, is sort of the evolution of the American dream. And like the way that we think of the American dream is very generic, right? Like it does not apply to everybody. Not everybody wanted to achieve the house, whatever, but it was sort of this thing that people would strive for, and it was kind of a defining feature of becoming an American. So like my grandparents are immigrants from Ireland. They came over here to achieve it. They were like, we want space. We grew up on a farm with like 17 other kids. There was no room for us. We're going to go here. There's a ton of space for us, and we're going to build a family, have jobs. And they did. And I think now, you know, it's just gonna it's very philosophical. Like we don't have the data on it in a major way, because AI is going to really potentially redefine our relationship to work. And if you go back to any like major philosopher, like they're kind of like, people define themselves through their work. They don't that's where a lot of people get meaning, especially in the States, as you pointed out. And so I think that's going to kind of change perhaps how we think about the American dream, is like, what does it look like to have a world where work is balanced, or is it going to be a different type of work, as we've seen with every other technological revolution? And then I think from a housing perspective, as the wealth transfer happens, like housing will free up, people will have more opportunity, but we'll probably have to think about the difference between housing as a speculative asset and a place to live. Is it healthy for home prices to go up 50% over the course of 5 years? No, but people want that. Like they see it as
Hmm.
something that builds out their wealth and their opportunity. And then yeah, I think
And
the
will the
kid.
childless people want to move into like four
Exactly.
bedroom, extremely high bill suburban homes?
Well, and that's the other thing. We have more housing stock than we've ever had, but the family units in each house are much smaller. So it's, instead of being 4 people per house, it's 2 people per house at the max. And so so a lot of people will point to the housing stock graph that you can get on the St. Louis Fed website and say, but look, we have all these homes everywhere, but like it's fewer and fewer people living in those homes. And
Yeah.
so that's an important point too. And then yeah, how younger people relate to relationships, how they think about having children. The fertility rate is below the replacement rate. And if we think about an aging population, that's going to create a shift in terms of, again, how the economy functions. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like I get to talk to a lot of people about what they view the American dream as being at. And I think a lot of people are questioning what America is right now. And so it creates something that's doubly interesting to walk through with people, but it is actively being redefined, as it always is, but in a pretty big way right now.
And my most realistic friends always tell me that there's no like fertility dump, that it's always cyclical, and this is just a period. And we can imagine that if the people who say that the fertility issues are primarily a housing issue, then in a couple of generations where bigger housing is
Yeah.
abundant, we will see the empirical reality here. Like, who was right? The problem is like there is theory, and then the reality is always like decades later, and you can hold an entire tenured job before actually like being proven super wrong in old age or posthumously about whether your theory worked or not. Guys, are there any questions here? Hands raised. I'm just looking at also the Zoom chat. Feel free to jump in if you have a question or a comment to Kyla, whether about what we've discussed or her pieces that you've read on the internet.
I've totally forgotten how to raise my hand in Zoom, so I'm just gonna speak up.
All right, and then I will go to Jay
Um,
after. Okay. Hi, Nat.
um,
Thank you for
Hello.
showing your Labubu. This is a safe space for Labubu ownership. There is no judgment, only a little
I
judgment.
must say that I'm also surprised that I own one.
All right.
And I was looking at it yesterday and I was like, why do I own one? I actually went to a store, Pop Mart, with my friend, and she was so excited. And this is gonna interest everyone here. Part of the reason why people are excited about Labubus, if you've never read 500 articles about it, is because they come in a mystery box. So unless you open, you actually don't know what you're getting. So there is an element of gambling and excitement and uncertainty that like is interesting to people. Um, but Kyle, I had a question for you. One, I really love your writing, and I've actually, this is the only intellect salon I've been to, so you can tell how much I like it because I'm here. Um, One thing I notice in my own role, and I'm coming from a perspective of an individual contributor in software industry, is that a lot of stuff is happening, but most of all, what is happening is the rate of change is incredibly, incredibly high. I wake up every day and a lot has changed. And what it makes me feel about the rest of the world, since it is impacted by technology so much more now, software has finally eaten the world. It's going to digest it, and we don't know what's going to come out at the other end. Is that the visibility over longer time frames isn't actually quite clear. I think when people make predictions and stuff, I really cannot. I don't believe anyone, and it's not because I don't believe in experts. It's very hard for me to see how, with the current rate of change, people can make sensible predictions over long term. So I'm really, really curious what you think about the near term. So, like, within 1 to 5 years, what are you expecting to change? And we should remove the possibility of war, because I think that's like a whole other discussion and it's too disruptive to talk about. But like apart from that, what makes what do you think is happening?
Yeah, I mean, war itself has also changed too. But I think so. I try not to do too many forecasts. I'm more of an analyst. But I think what I've noticed and what I hear from a lot of people in these conversations that I get to have, and even on this conversation I had on the Hill today, or one of them, is that we don't even really know how to measure kind of what we're going after. We don't know how to measure AI and what it's doing. We don't have the right numbers. We don't have the right idea around policy reform. And then we especially don't know the sort of trade-off that we're going to have with, if you think about Schumpeter, like creative destruction, like how creative will this be? How destructive will it be? And so I think that's like when we think about change over the next couple of years, I think number one, people are wiped out. Like that's the biggest thing I'm hearing lately is that, and it's interesting. I listen to a lot of I don't really know what to call them, but it's like comedian podcasts. Like if anybody listens to So True with Caleb Heron or Stavros Halkias, I think that's how you say his last name. I find them really interesting because the way that they talk about the world gives me insight into what their audience is feeling and therefore what more, maybe mainstream people are feeling. And there is this sense of tiredness and there's this sense of checking out and there's this sense of wanting to return to some semblance of normalcy. And so I think when we think about change in the world, I imagine that our relationship with technology is going to shift a lot over the next 2 years. I don't think it'll shift overnight, but I think there will be an exhaustion with elements of social media because of the way that even, I really used to love Twitter and what's happening there in terms of rage bait and the algorithm, I think that's going to burn a lot of people out. And then two, social media with Instagram, same sort of thing. So I think we're going to start seeing more and more people seek out conversations like this, so inter-intellect, where it's more curated, it's more personal, it's not as prone to being maybe corrupted isn't the right word, but influenced by an algorithm. I think people are going to try and strike their own path as much as possible. And then I think also there's going to be kind of a redefining of task-based work. So I think right now the way that we think about jobs is sort of like a concrete job. Like it's one job that you do, and that's the job that you do for a lot of people. But I think more and more so we'll end up breaking out labor into tasks instead of a career and thinking about it that way because that's where AI is most useful is task-based versus career-based. And so those are the two things that I'm really paying attention to is the relationship of people to social media, and then how we are going to think about work and defining work. And I think those are the two biggest things that could change in terms of the person, not in terms of the economy over the next couple of years. Does that make sense? In terms of the individual. Yeah.
I'm super curious about like I always think about like how I work. And when I first started interning like for real and I became a full-time employee of my own company, it was completely coinciding with COVID. I literally like moved into a studio apartment that okay, now I raised money and I'm going to like only focus on my company and guys really always watch what you ask for. Because I was like, I don't want to go anywhere. I just want to do this. And the world was like, great, shut down. It was not like by the level at which I prayed for less diversion and distraction, but it was really interesting, and I think there's a reason why COVID was such a weird kind of like opening Pandora's box, both good and bad, because for a lot of people, being at home gave them a chance to reacquaint themselves with almost like a childhood self of like who you really are in terms of your biological rhythm. Like, are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Are you actually a person who wants to work in like a super air conditioned, open plan office where you're like freezing to death and also it's like super loud and you can never finish a sentence in your mind? Or do you actually like to like sit in your garden with your pet turtle and like have a thought? Who are the people who, want to stop working every once in a while and like be with their children? Who are the people who definitely don't want to be with their kids and who are like, this was a mistake. I need to get a divorce. Like that was a lot of information that people got about themselves. I found out that I worked the same way as my like show business parents worked when I was a child, which was kind of like production based, like more like introverted mornings. And then you go and become more extroverted as the evening comes and like put on a show. But I didn't know that when I had to sit in an office. So I think the great in weirdification was really put on steroids by COVID, and not just in a bad way. Because I think whatever people learned about themselves and their actual like professional affinities, I think you can't unlearn this. And I think it was very task-based. And it's interesting that you said that. I think people were like, I need to do my job, and my job is actually like ABC tasks during the day, but how I do it, whether I'm like well shaved and wearing a suit or whatever, it's optional. And I think that's just a different kind of episteme, almost like a different way of like framing it in your mind, different logic. So I'm very, very interested about in that. DJ, welcome back.
I'm thinking a lot about, you know, the topic about the democracy part.
Mm.
Um, and on one hand, there's all these weird authoritarian threats, but on the other hand, if you ask a lot of the supporters, they think they're protecting democracy. Um, I mean, I was talking with a friend of mine, right in the period between the election and the inauguration, I was saying I was worried that Trump would try to violate a court order. And my friend said, well, he would never do that because, why would you throw out 200 years? And I said, no, that's not how it works. What happens is he says, I'm protecting, this great republic. I'm protecting the Constitution by, this overriding this unelected bureaucrat judge. I mean, it's just the way language works in politics. And I guess I'm not really sure how to frame the question exactly, but the sort of the tech right has kind of bought in to a pretty solid degree to the authoritarian project, as long as the tariffs don't affect them. And I'm just wondering, like, how should we even think about this question? Do we just kind of hope that things kind of snap back, or are we stuck in a sort of a permanent, escalated state? where everything comes down to like who is the most effective at um, getting their base angry enough to go out and vote.
Yeah, it's a tough question to answer. And I think specifically to the polarization that we're seeing, there's a new Gallup poll that came out that reported that most Americans are seeing themselves as independents. They don't see themselves as Democrats or Republicans. And I think that's because both sides have their own issues. Not to both sides it, but I think that's like one thing that's really important to pay attention to because when people declare that they're independent, they don't necessarily maybe participate. This is just what we see in the data. They don't necessarily participate in the election process as much. And so I think that's like one point of concern to your question about like, whoever riles up the base more. We do see people getting more and more polarized on either side. And it is becoming kind of a horseshoe theory where they agree with each other. So like Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump are now working together and capping credit card interest rates at 10%. So that's also kind of a funny thing that's happening. But in terms of kind of, I think the limits of what the administration's doing to the question of authoritarianism, like how far can this go? I'm really watching what's happening with Jerome Powell very closely because it's like kind of it's not the first time, but it's like one of the biggest moves that we have seen from the other countries, where other countries' central banks were like, hey, don't do this. Like the central bank should be independent. And it's like, okay, so they weigh on this, but like nothing else, I guess. And so I think what's happening there is like when you start threatening central bank independence, you start threatening the US dollar. And when you start threatening the US dollar, the stock market will turn against you and the bond market will turn against you. And the bond market, the question about like who's the arbiter of truth, the bond market is ultimately the arbiter of truth in the United States. I don't know if it'll exactly play out like this, but for example, in the United Kingdom with Liz Truss, she announced this mini budget. It was very inflationary. It was a ton of government spending. The bond market sold off, yields, everything became a total mess. And the bond market essentially ejected her because they rejected her policies. And so that's been my frustration with some of the actions that we've seen that I think ultimately do hurt the standing of the US dollar, which is much weaker than it was before Trump came into office, and then do hurt the standing of the United States in regards to other countries, is I think it's about time for the bond market to do something, but there's a level of complacency with the Trump always chickens out thing. So I think that will be the stop gap for in terms of like things going too far. In terms of the tech right, I don't study them enough to comment. I'm not sure if somebody else in the crowd can, but that's concerning to me as what they allow and approve of.
I'm in a big debate right now with my friends about. I think I didn't know this when I spent 7 years studying continental philosophy, but apparently I'm spending my 40s trying to determine with my friends what words mean and whether words are action, whether we should take it seriously or not. By the way, as a continental philosopher by training, I'm pleased by the epistemic direction that the United States of America has taken, where every individual now on this land is trying to determine what words are. It's good. It's like a good philosophical exercise, maybe not so fruitful for collective decision making and meaning making, but definitely exciting intellectually. And this is like one of the big questions, like, should we listen to what certain people are saying? Is that like, is it already bad that something was said? And it feels like I plan to spend my next years basically. I'm prepared that this is going to continue to be a question. Maybe this just comes with the internet that we no longer really know how to make sense of truth. And if the bond market can help, the bond market has my vote. And it can definitely oust any British leader it wants. Those guys are
It
not doing their
does.
job.
Yeah.
Sam, you have your hand up.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hi, welcome to InterIntellect.
Thank you. Yeah, this is my first session, and thanks. So, Kyla, you're right about economics. You talk to economists, read economics reports and papers. I am an economist by training, so I'm curious to ask you, what are your biggest complaints about economists, or if framed in a more positive manner, what are the things that you wish economists could be better or do better or like frame better in a way? And I say this understanding that when I say economist, it is a broad community of academics, policy, like people in academia, policy, tech, but nonetheless, I think we share similar training and way of thinking. So I'm curious about that. Thank you.
We will
Yeah.
cut a video clip from this part, Kyla, and just distribute it to all the economists.
Oh, yeah, do you mean economists as PhDs? Is that your defining measure?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I have I worked on the buy side. That's where I got my start. And then I worked at an investment education startup. I studied finance, economics, and data analytics when I was in school. And so I have like a background, not a PhD in this stuff. And I think the biggest thing that I've understood from economists and from studying economists, and Mary Daly, the president of the SF Fed, actually talks about this in the interview that we did, where she talks about how she thinks a central bank needs to communicate better. And I think the biggest thing is just using words that are not confusing. So, like, economics is a whole different language, like inflation, the labor market, GDP. Like, we have all of these, economics is all of these very confusing, the Phillips curve, like all of these very confusing ways to talk about, like, relatively simple things. And so that's been the biggest thing that, economists like Mary Daly, very established economists, will talk about, is like, we just got to be a little bit more simple and we got to be more direct, because right now communication is the most important thing that economists, especially central bankers, have. Mary Daly also said during this interview that inflation expectations, so how people feel about where inflation is going to go, is the most important thing for the central bank to watch. So it's not what inflation is doing, it's not what GDP is doing, it's not what unemployment's doing, it's how people feel about inflation. And so communication is ultimately like the most powerful tool that an economist can have. And where I see myself fitting in with the book that I wrote in this economy, and the various whatever else I do in the day to day, is trying to help translate this stuff to a general audience, as somebody who understands it, talks to so many people, and he just wants to help make a bit more sense of this. And I think the underlying theory is that if more people understand the economy, more people will make better decisions, and then ultimately we're all better off. So I'm not like yelling at economists and saying like, you have to communicate better, because everybody does have their own competencies. And so for a lot of economists, their time is much better spent like doing incredible research and trying to develop policy reforms and trying to figure out how we can measure the economy in a different way. And then where I think somebody like me can come in is helping to translate that. So I don't know if that's quite what you wanted me to say, or hopefully that answers your question. But that's, I think, what I hear from them, and then my feedback to them is like, that might not be what you have to do. You have people who can translate it for you, right? Yeah.
Jess?
I just want to thank Sam for asking that question and for Kyla talking about that, because as someone who doesn't have a background in any of this, whenever I read about economics, I'm always like, what? Even though it does intersect with the work that I've done and I've worked in, and Anna's going to kill me because every time we talk about stuff, I'm going to bring it up. But I read this book, Techno-Feudalism,
Okay.
by Yanis Verif. I can't pronounce his name.
I know.
And it was one of the first.
We're trying to invite him. So Jess,
Yeah.
we're trying to invite him so Jess can host him on Interact as a
He's
special
interesting.
guest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the first time I really understood things about the economy, because he was like, his book was just so easy to read. And
Politician.
yeah, and so anyways, but I'm not going to ask about him. I do want to talk about your article, The Architecture of Confusion, because I don't know if I just froze there. The
Oh, okay.
Architecture of Confusion, because I really resonated with that, and I think you wrote it in September, but I think what's happening right now, because CBS was actually sold and everything that happened after that, is really like affecting what's happening in the country right now. And I just wonder, what sort of recommendations could there be that could control something like this or even walk it back from how far it's gone in the United States? These sort of like huge conglomerates buying up all the communication and then essentially like all of this communication being filtered through just these few channels.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the FTC ideally would play a bit of a role. We have stop guards for this kind of stuff, and the Netflix deal, as well as is flashing red, and then Paramount now trying to by Warner Brothers. So I think that's like the thing that could really help if we had a regulatory body that was interested in stopping things like this. I think I don't really know how to stop it. That's a bit outside of the stuff that I spend a lot of time studying in terms of how to stop monopolies. There's, Lena Khan, who was the chair of Biden's FTC, has written a little bit about this, I think, and now she's on Mamdani's team in New York City. But I think in terms of how to navigate a world where, Paramount could also potentially own TikTok, you kind of just have to rely on sort of independent media in a big way, and it becomes very difficult to do that because it's very difficult to support all the different people trying to do independent media. And so a lot of people have hypothesized that independent media creators, independent newsletter writers, independent movie studios will have to sort of team up and band together and combine resources to fight stuff like this. But yeah, this one, that whole fiasco is very worrying. Sorry, that's probably not a very heartening answer to a very thoughtful question, but yeah, sorry.
Any comments on this?
Yeah, if somebody else has more enlightened feedback, please lay in.
Maybe this is actually a good moment to ask the famous D question, use the D word, which is decentralization. A lot of the more kind of elucidating commentary that I'm seeing on Twitter, Blue Sky, Substack, about the current both geopolitical and internal political events in the US are trying to interpret the events as a kind of, to some people, this is a natural process of centralization where, of course, the internet, of course, the capital centralization, et cetera, will lead to some form of more centralized power.
Mm-hmm.
To some people, this is a tragedy because it's like central planning, specters of past overreaches pop up, fewer civil liberties, fewer individual arenas of agency. But there are people who continue to see this as a process of decentralization, and not just in the sense that, the crypto world is alive and well and they are doing their own thing. The US has a crypto czar, et cetera, et cetera. Eric Adams has just released his own, tokens, but also in how people are becoming more independent and want to be online creators, want to be entrepreneurs. There might be less, centralization in how, employment is concentrated into cities, into companies. So I would be super curious to hear your thoughts on this, Kyla, whether you agree with those who say that this is, we're becoming more centralized, or that's actually an illusion and just the blah, blah, blah level. And even the demise of the Fed might mean that we are in the process of less centralization.
Oh, Jesus. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen with regards to the Fed. But in terms of like media consumption, we're very fragmented, but it's hard. as somebody who makes their living online, it's not easy. And so I think this idea that everyone can just be a solopreneur, the United States is not set up that way. The United States is set up for people to be W-2 employees. Um, and so I think if we want to encourage people to go down that path, companies like Substack have to take better care of the people on their platform, have some sort of health insurance option, et cetera. And same with Instagram, TikTok, because those companies really do benefit a lot from the IP that people are trying to share. And the individual creator might not benefit as much. And that's why a lot of people talk about collectives, grouping people together. This doesn't happen as much as it maybe as one would expect. But then
This is like the WGA, like the Writers Guild Association, or like the Hollywood actors who, I think if you have 2 signed roles a year, you get health insurance. And that's like that's great because it's like both a kind of social net in the European sense, but it's also a great economic incentive because even if you have like one role that gives you enough money to live all year, which sometimes happens in show business, right? Like you can cash out, you will continue working and going to auditions and keeping the machinery going because you're economically incentivized to be productive, which is the American story, right? That you don't get the social net because the system wants you to like bust your ass every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
So Substack guilt.
People are working. People are working on that. I'm not a part of those conversations, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting conversations around what it looks like for you have labor and you have capital, and capital is there's a great Bloomberg article talking about how labor is getting a smaller and smaller share of the economy. So things are getting more and more productive, but people are getting less and less of that productivity. I think they're capturing like 43% of labor's captured. I'm not going to misquote it, but it's not as much as it should be, and it's shrinking rapidly. And so there's this kind of big trade-off right now between labor and capital, where capital is capturing a bunch of the upside, labor is not so much. And so a lot of groups are doing a lot of work to try and come into that balance. The main way that we do something like that is through unions. And so there's a big focus on unionization. And I had the chance to talk to Num Schreiber, who is the author of the forthcoming book called Mutiny that's coming out in April 2026. He's a reporter at the New York Times, and it talks about, the path that a lot of these workers who are maybe part-time or are seeking healthcare benefits from their employer, how they've gone down the path of unionization to try and achieve that at companies like Starbucks, at companies like Amazon, at companies like Google. And so I think that's going to be the other part of the conversation is what role does labor play in a world that is increasingly hostile to labor? That doesn't answer any part of your decentralization question. If anything, I guess it points towards more centralization and unionization. But yeah.
I mean, especially in the fields where that cannot be automated, right? Because
certain jobs, yeah.
Certain jobs, yeah. Or maybe the argument would actually be that the areas that will be possibly automated, the unionization should be even faster because you have a limited time, whereby I'm pretty sure that in 20 years, we will be more appreciative of elder care because we will not necessarily have robotics technology in place yet that is emotionally fulfilling and practical enough to replace care workers. But we will be old enough to need them. DJ, more comments? I love this.
Yeah,
Bring it on.
I mean, I'm not an economist, but I read stuff. And I feel like a lot. So housing is a special thing because of the regulations surrounding it and how intensely local it is. But I feel like everything else, when it comes to people complaining about costs, at least big costs like education, healthcare, is basically just the Baumol effect. Um, and AI, I mean, I use it every day in my job or my work. I don't have a job. And but it's destabilizing, as a programmer. It's like my job went from like getting deep into the code to just sort of giving some instructions and then just going, yeah, that looks pretty good, submit. And I worry that that's like what everything is going to be. And so, like, except with the exception of physical goods, which have like a real infrastructure that has to be used to deliver them, everything else, the marginal cost goes to zero. And but the areas where like costs are highest and we're most concerned are healthcare, for old people like me, and then education for young folks. And those are only going to get more and more expensive unless we start bringing AI to that, which I'm actually for when it comes to healthcare. But I just wonder I mean, I am starting to worry about mass unemployment, I guess. Just if my job is any indication, because for the longest time that was the sneer, like learn to code. Well, I learned to code. Now, what do you tell someone to go learn?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's things like mining engineer, like we're gonna need a ton of that kind of stuff. And so there's like 2 points, I think. Like Baumol's cost disease is really interesting because essentially with productivity and how that's risen, goods have gotten really cheap, right? So it's like easy. Goods, food's gotten cheap, clothes have gotten cheap. Like we've just gotten very productive and very good at making certain things. But as we've gotten more and more productive at making goods cheaper, it doesn't always apply to services. So services has gotten more expensive because it's much harder to make a doctor 100 times more productive than it is to make fruit 100 times more productive, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about Baumol's cost disease. And the idea is that AI is going to be able to step in and help service costs go down. And therefore, the doctor will become less expensive. The coding, I guess, will become less expensive. The education will become less expensive because you have this thing that's going to like perfectly automate every human away or whatever. And so that's kind of the challenge with Baumol's cost disease. And it goes back to that conversation around labor and capital too, because there is this like weird world that's very hard to conceptualize where capital can also go to zero. Like if all of a sudden the technology becomes very, very good at making things, where's the upside? It's primarily probably going to be in goods production, as DJ said, but it's again going to be a different universe. And then in terms of education too, we're going to have to tell people to study different things. And that's already happening. And it's already a very challenging conversation because college itself has really shifted. And that's where apprenticeships are going to become more important. But you can't you don't want to chat GPT your way through college because you haven't learned much at that point. So yeah, this is why AI policy is so important. And it's kind of frustrating that we haven't done much with it. It's heading towards us very quickly. And there are these big issues, these big hairy issues. Yeah.
Absolutely. Neha, you are the last question today.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No pressure.
No pressure.
We already discussed Labubus. This is a safe space.
Oh my God. I will not be discussing Labubus. So my positive view of the future is that the quality of everything should go up. I was educated, but I know my education could have been like 10x better, not just in terms of theory, but in practice, like all the skills I learned during school and all of that. Quality of everything can be better. The quality of medical care people receive, the quality of, I guess, the quality of time people get to spend with each other because our machines and systems are more productive. It's like how the dishwashers gave time back to homemakers. And so to me, what's missing very often is also like the cultural narrative of how this makes things better in a very, very tangible way, while also kind of like limiting the downside. One of the ways I could think is like, okay, can we try out 4-day work weeks? Like, what do people do with the third day? What if they spend more time with each other? Maybe they will have more kids. I just feel like as a worker, it's very hard to see. Like, it's very hard to cope with uncertainty while the rest of the parameters of my life remain similar. And so I can tell you from an individual, even in tech, it's a very interesting story. It's like we're sitting on a branch and cutting it. And we are not seeing this, not everybody seeing the same benefits in tech. If you're not working at OpenAI, Anthropic, and like the 10 other labs where they keep poaching people from each other, it's a very different story. And so I actually think, and I think this is, if people in AI and policy think long term, we really need to you need to give something to people. That is a true platform of any kind, which is like leave something on the table. And I feel like there's nothing on the table. And I think that's what makes things, this is such a non-generous environment in so many ways. And I just feel like that cultural narrative needs to change. People need to come up and say what are the positive things going to happen and give you a preview of it versus like creating all this anxiety that I don't think is going to do anything good. I feel like people are getting stressed out and just like, I think everybody's acting poorly. That's what I feel. Like I go on Twitter, I'm like, everybody's insane. I go in real life, things are so much better. And I feel like things can be even better in real life if we change some of the cultural conversations we are having. This is not a question. I'm literally venting to you right now, but I'm kind of curious what you think 4-day work weeks could do. Or am I just, pushing my own agenda here?
No. I mean, yes, people vent to me all the time. It's good. It's very helpful. But I think Senator Mark Kelly, he spoke today, and one thing, he's in kind of drama right now, but one thing that he said is we have to learn how to build trust in each other again, and trust in this technology that's common, trust in institutions, and that if you look at the Harvard Youth Poll, like nobody trusts anything anymore. And so I think that's kind of when we think about policies like the 4-day work week, that can help, like just little experiments like that. And a lot of companies have experimented with that and it's gone well. People are happy. They're just as productive because it turns out not everybody's productive during an 8-hour workday. That's a byproduct from the Industrial Revolution. And so I think it does come down to experimentation and sort of learning what people want, learning how to rebuild trust with them. And so I think things like that do make sense to try, especially if this tool is making us that much more productive, apparently. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good note to end on experiments of rebuilding trust. I mean, we've been doing this with InterIntellect for altogether over 10 years now. And in the current format, we're entering the 7th year, which is obviously an incredible feeling, but also, we've been through so much with InterIntellect. I mean, starting in like early 2019. And, I often personally think about where next, like where I want to develop this organization toward, or like in what direction. And for me, it's all about going back to the foundations this year. Fewer celebrities, fewer, oh, this person has written 17 books, they must know better what's up. I think nobody knows what's up right now. Everybody maybe has like a fragment of what's happening. And this has to be a kind of collective intelligence year that is about the people, because unless we feel comfortable enough to share our own angle on things and our own personal experience without judgment or expectation or, assuming what the other person would say when I say this, I don't think that the trust can be rebuilt. I think it's a kind of barn raising year, and whatever anybody can do in your own lives, whether you're a famous TikToker with a wonderful book contract, and huge leverage and huge platform and respect, or you're just, I don't know, organizing a carpool with the parents in your neighborhood, there's always a little thing that you can do that just show one person that they can trust a stranger. Just listen to one person who is not used to being listened to. Because they will also pay it forward, and we can create the same way as the negative trend was created. I think we can create a positive one, but we have to want to do it. It doesn't just fall into our laps. It's not a natural phenomenon. It's something that people do and keep doing even when it feels a little bit hopeless or pointless, because it never is. That would be my general takeaway. Kyla, thank you for joining us in this crazy, crazy, crazy months where I don't know how you guys feel, but I feel like I've been in 2026 for like 5 months and it's literally been like 2 weeks. Let's hope it's going to calm down a little bit in a good way. And yeah, just lots of love to you, Kyla. We adore you. You're doing really something extraordinary here. And I'm so happy that your work is recognized, that you are invited into DC, that they take you seriously, that you can sit down with these people and tell them what you know and what you find out. And that you tell them that they need to speak more comprehensively if they want to win the hearts of normal people, because we don't know what they're saying. So that's always a great, great message. We hope that we will see you again soon, and best of luck with your book.
Yeah, thank you. And Cruz linked, sorry, I hope that's how you say your name, but he linked a couple of videos.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and Justine is referencing Abundance, which is a very interesting book by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, that if you're looking for a more hopeful outlook and like market-driven policy solutions, they did capture it very well in that book, and it's a very breezy read. So if you want like a little bit of hope, I do recommend that. They did a great job. The Abundance Movement in general.
It's very readable. Like it literally is written to be
Very, yeah.
rare. I love this. Yeah, abundance is a very, very interesting movement. Thank you so much, Kyla. Fly safe, get home safely, and biggest hugs to your dogs.
Yes, yes. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and the great questions, commentary. You are amazing. I will see you very soon.
Bye.
Take care.